I wanted to question what really counts as a relationship. And if you're primarily in a sort of deep platonic relationship, could you maybe have sexual or romantic connections outside of that? What does that look like?
Hello and welcome, fellow human. My name is Zachary Stockill, and you are listening to Humans in Love, a podcast that looks at culture, relationships, and personal development from unconventional perspectives. Join me as I dig into the question of how people like you and I might get more out of life and love. Thanks for being here. Hey there. Hi. How are you? I hope you're having a tremendous week so far, dear anonymous listener, wherever you are in the world. Speaking of which, I'd really like to hear from you. I'm always curious about where people are listening to the podcast, where they're coming from, what your life is like. It just kind of helps me get a better sense of who's actually listening to this, and thus, hopefully, I can tailor my show a little bit to you. And to just, it's just nice having kind of reality check about who's actually listening to this, because I'm standing right now at my vocal booth looking at my laptop and this kind of gray foam padding, and you can kind of feel like you're speaking into the void a little bit. And I know there's people out there. I've been checking the download numbers. I know you exist. So yeah, send me an email or a tweet or something, and let me know how you're doing, and let me know what you think of the show. It's always great to hear from you guys, and it just makes it more fun for me, actually, to keep doing this. I am going to record this and get on my bicycle. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I've become kind of obsessed with cycling lately. I don't know if you're like that, but I tend to go deep. If I get interested in something, I kind of want to learn everything about it, and it's kind of all I can think about doing for a little while. And for me, that's cycling right now. And I know, I think it was the last episode, or perhaps the one before, it was the one where I recorded it just after Anthony Bourdain checked out. And I've had the worst year of my life over the past year. And the reason I think I'm still standing above everything else, to cut a long story short, I lost a couple of people who are extremely important to me. And I really think the reason I'm still standing, aside from the love and support of people around me, is exercise. And again, this sounds like a really obvious point, but I think it's taken me almost 30 years to really fully understand how important and impactful and transformational exercise can be if you're dealing with any kind of trauma or pain or depression or anything like that. The whole idea about the runner's high and the high you can get from exercise, that's a thing. That's a real, tangible thing. And it's taken me way too long to acknowledge that. And for me, spending a long time on my bicycle every day, usually 2 or 3 hours, and doing yoga regularly, for me, that's been my saving grace. I also lift weights. I'm trying to stay busy, and I'm trying to keep my body active, because I find without fail, I start feeling really bad and really low and, less motivated. I have way less energy when I'm spending long hours in front of my computer or, staying isolated away from the world and not being physically active. So I don't know where you're at in life, but I can just tell you from my own experience, thank God for cycling, thank God for exercise, and thank God for these beautiful bodies that we really have to kind of work to maintain. I hope that doesn't sound preachy, but I just thought I'd mention that because I feel like it took me way too long to really realize how important exercise was to my mental health, and maybe it'll help you too. My guest today is a very funny woman, a very interesting woman who wears many hats. Her name is Rosie Wilby. She's a comedian, musician, writer, and broadcaster based in London, England. As a comedian, she's performed at Sydney Mardi Gras, the Comedy Store, the Latitude Festival, and on BBC Radio 4. As a musician, she's performed at Glastonbury, Ronnie Scott's, and on Carlton TV. She has hosted a series of really fascinating one-person shows around relationships and dating and stuff. But I think the main reason I wanted to talk to her is her new book. She just published her first book. It's called Is Monogamy Dead? Rethinking Relationships in the 21st Century. Now, before that might put you off, keep in mind that the book the title is a question, not a statement. It's asking, is monogamy dead? Because it seems very timely. This is an issue that I think is coming up for a lot of people. And I think we're kind of divided into two camps. Those of us who are willing to talk about it and have an open, honest discussion about it, and those people who are pretending that there is no problem with the way we currently think about monogamy. And for many people, there's no reason for them to question monogamy because they're in really satisfying, healthy, exciting monogamous relationships and everything's going great. But I think for the rest of us, when you look at the divorce rate and when you look at the conversations we're having around relationships in our society, it feels like something has to change. We need new language. We need some new ideas. And I think we need some broader conceptions of monogamy. And that's the main reason I wanted to talk to Rosie. She's also the host of a very interesting podcast called the Breakup Monologues, which we'll get to later in the show. Before we begin, a quick reminder that if you're enjoying my podcast and you'd like me to continue making new episodes, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on iTunes or your podcast app of choice. Without any further ado, I hope you enjoy a very wide-ranging discussion with comedian, author, broadcaster Rosie Wilby. First off, I'd love to know, you have a really interesting backstory when it comes to how you got into comedy. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that. Like, how did you become a stand-up?
Well, a slightly strange, circuitous route, as you say. I was a musician. I was a singer-songwriter with a band and wrote very sort of heartfelt, romantic songs about my relationships gone wrong and more. And yeah, eventually when the band all went their separate ways, many people came up to me at gigs having really enjoyed the between song chat, which actually I did more of when I did a few solo gigs, I guess to kind of make up for the fact there was no band providing, this big full backdrop of noise. And so, yeah, I used to tell very self-deprecating stories about what the song was about, or kind of make fun of the fact that many of my songs were a bit bleak, as songwriters often are, a little bit dark and depressive, aren't they? So I would make fun of myself a little bit in a very self-deprecating way, and that eventually led people to say, you know what, you should have a go at comedy, because although the songs were not comedy songs, people were really laughing at the things that I said in between. So yes, I entered a few comedy competitions. There's some comedy contests here in the UK, in London. So You Think You're Funny, Funny Women, Laughing Horse. Laughing Horse is a funny one. There's another one called Amused Moose. Lots of strange animals. But I kind of got to the latter stages of all those competitions about 10 years ago, and then started getting regular work in the comedy clubs and comedy nights. There's such a kind of diversity of different type of comedy nights here in London, and I'm sure it's the same in big cities all around the world. When I have occasionally done performances in LA or New York, there are comedy nights that are perhaps not like your kind of very typical Friday night, Saturday night comedy nights. There are gay comedy nights here. There are women-only bills. There are, comedy nights that have a particular feel. There are literary comedy nights. There are a bit of a mix of a literary salon and a comedy night. There are themed comedy nights where everyone's talking about a particular theme. So there's so many different niches where different people can fit in. And I suppose I wouldn't have necessarily thought of myself as a stand-up comic in a very old school sense. Obviously we have this kind of very male picture of a stand-up comedian from, a couple of decades or so ago. And in fact, there's been a really interesting film released here just recently called Funny Cow, where the actress Maxine Peake plays a female comic in the very sort of working class male comedy clubs and kind of working men's clubs. So we have a certain idea of a of a comedian, which I think still stands, even though we have lots of women doing it now. And so I wouldn't necessarily have thought of comedy as the right thing for me as a kind of sensitive singer-songwriter, but I've found different types of comedy nights.
So from one earnest singer-songwriter type to another, is that dream over for you? I was very curious about that because, well, just personally speaking, I'm a creative person with a lot of different interests, and I've always found it difficult to sort of narrow those down and pursue one thing at a time. It's just kind of the way I'm wired. I mean,
Yes.
What was that decision like did you kind of decide enough with the music, I'm going to pursue comedy full time, or what was that process like?
I don't know whether conscious decision would be the right way to put it. It was more of a gradual transition, and just the realities of, actually, this is where the momentum is. This is where I'm making some money. When I was performing with a band, we would get paid gigs, but then you're splitting the money around lots of people. So I just think the realities of, for me, being a creative person wasn't something I wanted to do as a hobby alongside a normal job. Many people do that so that they have the creative freedom of not needing to earn money from it and just doing creatively whatever they want. But I want to sort of get paid for it in some way. I sort of see that as some kind of affirmation that if it's your job that you're being paid for, there's some kind of recognition that you're doing it to a professional standard in some way, even if it's not everybody's bag and there's some reviewers that don't like it. I kind of wanted to get paid. So I guess, there was just a kind of practical decision on in that sense, that actually there was some interest in promoters, venues kind of booking me and paying me to do my comedy shows. That said, some of my comedy shows have a sort of musical element. One of them looked back at my music career in quite a light-hearted way, and kind of had some of my old photos from the band. It was kind of called How Not to Make It in Britpop. So I used to perform some of my old songs as part of that show, which meant that some people went back and rediscovered my very old ancient album. So that was nice. And then other songs that have not directly had my own music in them have had a strong kind of soundtrack running through them of music that I love. So I feel that music is there in a sense. And in my book that I published last year, that had a whole section that was set against the backdrop of my career as a musician. And again, music, even in other sections of the book, music is often referenced in terms of love and relationships, because of course music really can enhance in good and bad ways how we are feeling. So we always have kind of breakup songs or songs that we listen to when we get together with people. So there's definitely a lot of references to music throughout a lot of the work that I do.
Does what you're doing now in terms of comedy and writing and podcasting, does that scratch the same itch that writing, performing, recording your own music did?
I think so. It scratches a different itch, but I think the key thing is connection with people, with an audience. And so there's something very special about making a room full of people laugh. I do strive in my solo comedy shows, as in the sort of hour-long shows I might do at the Edinburgh Fringe or at festivals around the world, as opposed to when you do a club set of 10 minutes, 15 minutes or 20 minutes. I think in those longer shows I would strive to have some emotional terrain as well as just the, gag, let's make people laugh. I try to have some kind of depth and some variety and nuance in those shows, which is not always easy to achieve, because people may be expecting you to be funny throughout and not go off into a sort of emotional detour, but a lot of audiences really like that as well. So I think it's not so much about singing live, which was lovely and wonderful, but it's about being able to explore emotions. And I think if you use comedy and humour cleverly, I think you can you can do that. But it's an interesting, there are subtle differences between the different types of art forms. I think in the book I was creatively quite satisfied because I could explore kind of dark stuff and quite deep stuff, as well as look at things through a humorous lens. That there's a lot of quite vulnerable stuff as well, which perhaps you can't always do on stage in comedy, or at least it's difficult to pull off in a shorter set. So I think the book was quite creatively rewarding. I mean, it was very challenging in other ways when I sort of started to learn about how the publishing industry works, which is so different from how comedy and music industries work. But creatively, it was a very rewarding process.
And the book is Monogamy Dead?
That is the title of the book. Well done for getting it right. It is a question. I say that not completely joking. Is monogamy dead? Because so many people have interviewed me about it and said that Rosie's book is called Monogamy is Dead, as if I'm kind of making a statement, whereas actually I'm asking a question.
That would be a very different book.
It would indeed. I mean, I had been through a phase of thinking maybe monogamy is dead, but I've come around to thinking actually it's alive and well, but we needed to sort of reevaluate, redefine monogamy for modern times and for modern living. So, I've really come on quite a journey in terms of what I think about monogamy. But it's interesting how many people kind of make an assumption that if you're questioning monogamy, then you must be thinking that it's completely out of date or completely not fit for purpose. And I think perhaps our old version of it maybe is, and I think we do need to think about our language around relationships and how conscious we are in relationships, and really look at those skills and develop those. But monogamy as an actual concept, I think is alive, but I think we need to maybe learn about how we can be monogamous from people who are not being monogamous, because in actual fact, the people I interviewed who were opening up their relationships, who were polyamorous, they were actually, in many cases, communicating much, much more about honesty, about respect, about consent, about compassion, about how to really, really talk and really open up and be vulnerable in relationships and sort of talk about their deepest desires and fears and secrets. Whereas, of course, many of us who've been in monogamous relationships have, perhaps been the keepers of many, many secrets.
Yeah. I want to get more into the book in a minute, but first off,
Sure.
Where did this interest in relationships and dating and sexuality, where did that come from? I mean, like for me, for example, I was growing up and I think I've always kind of been interested in these topics. Like, was the same true for you?
Yes and no. I think when I came out as gay in my sort of late teens, obviously the ideas around sexuality and sexual orientation were of huge interest to me, because I realised that I was gay sort of during my late teens in the late 1980s, which was an incredibly homophobic time. We had Margaret Thatcher installed as Prime Minister in the UK, and she was not a fan of the gays. She was a big fan of sort of family values in a very old school traditional sense of family values. So it was interesting times. So I think for me, I wanted to understand why some people were gay, what that meant. I was fortunate enough to have a mum who was very open-minded and liberal about these things at a time when not everybody's parents would have been. I mean, I even do some jokes about how when I came out to her, she sort of tried to tell me something about one of her and one of her close female friends, you know, when they used to go on holiday together before she got married. And, you know, it was one of those like, oh, no, you don't want to hear about your parents kind of having had same-sex flings or even having a sexuality or anything. So, Yeah.
Can I just pause you for one moment?
Yes.
I mean, because this is really interesting to me, and I want to understand this better. And maybe this is an obvious point, but I mean, I'm straight, and so in a certain sense, I can't really imagine growing up and having this feeling that who you're attracted to, the leader of your country, kind of is suggesting that there's something wrong with that or unnatural. I mean, that must be really
Yeah.
confusing.
Yes, it's really tough. I mean, it wasn't just, I mean, I obviously single her out because she was such a such a kind of prevalent figure in our country's culture when I was a teenager. So you kind of felt like if this person who seemed so powerful and so omnipresent was saying something was wrong, that felt like that was kind of a all-encompassing message. But yeah, I mean, it really filtered down into kind of schools, obviously churches and religion, and many of my friends at school who had parents who were more conservative or more religious and so on, um, who would have kind of, I mean, many of these people, of course, completely have changed their minds now as they've got older and laws have changed in this country and indeed are changing in many places around the world. So I think people, it's not like these were bad people who were like, oh, gay people sinners, and that they were just sort of repeating what they had heard from previous generations, and it was just something that they had been told was the way things were, that it wasn't right. So yeah, it's very hard to kind of fight it against that. But then I think even as a smaller child, I always kind of enjoyed a sense of rebellion. I think there was something quite exciting about being different and not being the same as everyone else. So whilst there was a sense of potential isolation and feeling like a weirdo or not right in some way, there was also this kind of exciting sense of doing something different to everyone else. And I had a strong sense always that once I got to London, I would find other people, other like-minded people, and find some kind of sense of things being okay in terms of being gay, at least. And that was certainly true when I moved to London in the early 1990s. And of course, there was a big gay culture and gay community, and that was a really strong kind of sense of family. And it was actually, in many ways, a really wonderful time to be gay because there were parties and clubs and kind of lots of community activities, book groups and theatre groups and activism groups. And you really felt part of something to be gay then in a big city. Whereas, of course, now it's that a lot of that has fragmented and dissolved. And I write about this a bit in the book and how that's shaped my kind of sense of family and community, and how in some ways it's a little bit heartbreaking. There's almost a sense of loss that gay people, now we have some equal rights and we can get married like straight people do. The fact that everybody's rushing to do that, it's kind of breaking up some of the big gay family and big sense of community and really looking after one another in the face of prejudice that we had before. It's this real ultimate paradox of progress having some kind of quite sad side effects where we've lost something quite precious, where we'd kind of built our own sense of family and friendship and loyalty that was really quite special.
That's fascinating. I hadn't. So the family unit is kind of challenging Pride Month, or something like that.
Well, almost, but Pride, but kind of not just Pride Month, but Pride, the sense of pride and the sense of family and community that the LGBT or queer community, or I mean, kind of, we didn't really use words like queer like a couple of decades or so ago. It was kind of lesbian and gay. We were inclusive of bisexual and transgender people, but perhaps not as consciously as we might be now. So yeah, there was this real sense of something, of togetherness that we've lost a tiny bit now. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think obviously this is particularly heartbreaking for you and your involvement in the gay community. But I mean, I think just the breakdown of community in general in the West is really striking to me.
Yeah, I think
Everywhere I go, I feel that way.
yeah, I think it's such a an individualistic age now with social media and selfies, and it is the age of narcissism, isn't it? And obviously there are good elements of social media and the digital. I mean, we can talk to each other easily now, but I think it's yeah, I think there's something about human connection that is slipping through our fingers a little bit.
It's irreplaceable, that feeling of actually sharing a space with someone, looking into their eyes, watching their micro movements and just sharing that physical space. There's something truly irreplaceable about that. But that's another podcast.
Isn't it?
But I cut you off earlier. So you said you started looking more into relationships and psychology and sex and dating. You said something to the effect you were trying to figure out, like, why are some people gay? Why are some people not? Is that kind of the genesis of this interest for you then?
Well, that was partly a doorway opening, and partly that was an element of my first show, my first comedy show that I did about love and relationships was called The Science of Sex a few years ago, which turned into a really popular show that I often revive and get asked to perform again. And I've mostly performed it in the UK, but I did perform it in New York at a queer arts festival called Fresh Fruit, and that was lots of fun.
So many good names.
Yeah. So yeah, that was a key part of that show was looking at why people have a certain sexual orientation. I was quite interested to understand that. But really, it was also about why we might be, the more universal questions of why we might be attracted to one person or another, why we might feel like some of this passion fizzles out in the later stages of a relationship, why we go into a sort of different phase of love, why we seem to only recognize the very heady early stages of love as romantic love. What messages the media have given us about romantic love. So there were a lot of messages in that first show, and the origins of our sexual orientation were just a part of it, but this was all a kind of a way in. And I think the key thing was the relationship that I was in when I started comedy was very beautiful in its origins, and very kind of loving and romantic, but actually deeply troubled and challenged by, initially by her family not knowing that she was gay, and that was incredibly challenging. So it's back to kind of obviously homophobia and shame around homosexuality and so on. And also just the challenges of two people kind of meshing together, perhaps when they've had this kind of really romantic beginning that's been unreal, of how to try and have a real relationship. And this relationship did actually, in the end, kind of on and off, via a roller coaster route, kind of last maybe 5 years, but it sort of was quite a difficult ending, and it had been quite a difficult, difficult relationship along the way at certain points, but not because anyone is to blame and is a bad person or anything like that, but just because sometimes relationships are incredibly challenging and difficult. And I wanted to understand why this relationship wasn't working, I suppose, and then ultimately understand why it had ended. And, it took many years to actually, my final part of my trilogy of shows that I toured about love and relationships was called The Conscious Uncoupling, and was about breakups. And so I finally wrote about that breakup kind of 5 years on, from receiving, initially sort of being dumped by email. So receiving the breakup email. Yeah, I know. Oof. I know. But now that's kind of more common, that people get broken up with by digital means. But
after 5 years?
Yeah, I know.
Oof. I know. I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
Oh, well, I think through writing about it, I've been able to process things much, much more. And it, I think it is, creativity can be incredibly cathartic.
Speaking of catharsis and healing, get as personal or not as you want, but how did you power through that breakup? I mean, what got you through that? That must have been challenging, to say the least.
Oh, yeah, really, really, really challenging. But I think ultimately creativity and writing, and like I say, I didn't really visit the breakup in my work until a little while later. But yeah, I think performing is a real kind of solve for loneliness, or feeling not right in the world, because I think performing connects you. I think largely speaking, I found the bonds between comedians, particularly fellow female comedians on the circuit, those bonds are really good. Like, there'll be people that you don't gig with for a while, and then you see them again, and you just have a real giggle or a hug backstage, and you say, oh God, I'm having a lousy time, I got dumped, and it's like, oh, how are you? Oh. So there's generally a nice camaraderie. There are some people who are, pains in the bum, but mostly people are really, our fellow performers are really nice and down to earth and good people. And I think comedians have come often from the perspective of being in some way outcasts or feeling like the weird one at school. So I think actually we kind of understand one another quite well. So I think performing really was a driver to getting through that in the end, and writing and expressing myself and finding ways of talking about love and heartache and heartbreak. And I mean, when I did do the show eventually about the breakup, so many people came to me afterwards and said, oh, it's so good to talk about this stuff. We don't talk about it enough. And, it's helped me think about my breakup. It's helped me communicate with my ex. There was one day I did the show, and I happened to ask a girl how she knew about the show and why she'd come along, and she said, oh, my ex came last night.
That's funny. So what did that show entail? What was your take? Was this more of like a storyline, or was this about the science behind breakups?
That show was kind of like a storytelling show, but there were the visits of 3 ghosts in it of our romantic past, present, and future, with sort of slightly spoofy bits of science, kind of like warnings about the dangers of nostalgia and looking back with really rose-tinted glasses, but also the conflicts between real love and our sense of what romantic love perhaps should be and what real relationships are. And then kind of with a sort of spoofy warning about where we could go in the future if our kind of the pace at which we kind of reject people on Tinder and dating apps kind of continued. It could be this, like we were sort of suggesting, we kind of become this really soulless society. So kind of my ghost of the future had come from this terrible place where love was quite literally a battlefield, and she sort of had a little sword and shield.
Pat Benatar for the win. Isn't that amazing though? Like, why do we do that? The rose-colored glasses bit, because it's true. You break up with someone, and then a month or two later, all you can remember is the good times and that stroll in the park and how pretty they looked in that dress and blah 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 blah. I was talking to someone the other day who's going through a breakup, and they were pretty fresh out of the relationship, and so they still remember all the nasty bits. And I said, write it down, record some kind of audio diary, like record this because you'll forget. Like, it's amazing. I don't know why we do that.
Yeah, we do. It's true. Yeah, I think. I mean, in a way, it's nice. Ultimately, when you were ultimately feeling over it, it's quite nice to remember the good stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, ultimately being the key word there.
Yes. Yeah.
So what goes into a one-person show like that? I mean, there must be just a tremendous amount of writing and planning and work. And do you write it almost like you'd write a book or something like that, in terms of structuring it very clearly, or how does that work?
I think with that show I did, and what's interesting is the kind of storytelling sections of that show that were kind of, I had alternating timelines, so I would go between two different positions on the stage. So you would already know at the beginning of the show that the relationship had ended, because I would be talking about being dumped by email, and the audience would really be with me and like, oh no. And then I'd go to the other side of the stage where the lighting would subtly change, and I would sit down and read from a storybook about the beginnings of the relationship, and there would be lovely music playing. And so you would kind of get this sense of things sounding wonderfully romantic, but of course being very bittersweet because you know it's going to end. So that show was very much written with a word-for-word script, but not all of my more comedic shows would be written in that way, because you don't want to sound like you're delivering a monologue when you're doing a more stand-up-y show. That would tend to have more keywords and structure. I often draw a diagram for those kind of shows. So, yeah.
What's opening night like for a show like that? I mean, are you nervous? Because you put all this work into something and you're about to unleash it on the world, and there's a chance that it could go south. I mean, what's that like? Are there a lot of nerves?
What comedians tend to do is preview shows, which generally would be quite intimate and would be cheaper tickets and would be with a bit of a kind of proviso that, look, this is a work in development. It's not the finished article yet. Although sometimes those are my favourite shows. And actually I'll often love the show the most when it's brand new. But yeah, I think because you have those early shows as kind of previews, perhaps that eases the stress a tiny bit, because you know that, if you want to say no reviewers at the first show, you can do that, and you can, kind of just invite a special audience of friends and make it, or you might, what some people do now is kind of preview shows in their own homes or other people's homes, like a kind of a lounge gig. So yeah, you can make it more kind of comfortable than a big premiere.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, as long as we're on this topic, though, I'm going to come back to comedy because it's just one of my favorite things to learn about. When you're first starting out as a stand-up, like when you first start going on stage with like the idea not to make music, but I'm going to try to make these people laugh for 5 or 10 minutes, was there a big adjustment there? Were you nervous? Or because you had a ton of experience on stage as a musician, were you less nervous?
I guess less nervous, but of course it's nerve-wracking. I mean, I did do some of the gigs where, like everyone does, where you completely die and you're like, oh my God, what's happening? But I think I was more nervous as a musician, because I think as a musician, it felt like there was more jeopardy. It felt like more could go wrong. Like if the sound engineer didn't make you sound nice, or I don't know. It's strange, isn't it? Because so much can go wrong with comedy. But I think because I'd become more resilient by doing a fair amount of performance as a musician. And I think going on a stage in front of people didn't terrify me too much. So I thought I would always have a strategy. I think I would always have something to fall back on, even if it was just chatting to the audience and ad-libbing from what they were saying.
When you're on stage, performing stand-up, are you trying to actively read the audience? Like, are you looking to make eye contact? Are you looking to see how certain people react to different things? Because I think I can relate to this a little bit. I'm a DJ, so I really try to read the audience when I'm playing and try to sometimes tailor what I'm doing to try to make more people dance and have, try to help people have a better time. What are you doing on stage? And is that different than being the earnest singer-songwriter, so to speak?
Yeah, I think so. I think, that said, I generally do have a set list of what I'm going to do at comedy night, because normally you have a set time. And so if you go off tangent completely, then you sort of lose track of how long you've done. And you have to have a sneaky glance at your watch or something. Yeah, even if I'm sticking to a fairly known set list, Of course, you're going to make it sound spontaneous. And of course, you're going to look at certain people in the audience and gauge who's really enjoying it and keep checking in with them and keep eye contact with them regularly, and also try and engage some of the other people who aren't initially laughing as much. Try and think, why is that person not engaging? And kind of pull them in, I guess. But I'm often drawn to the people in the audience who are really enjoying it, because their energy usually is infectious and spreads around the room anyway.
Right. What about your writing process? I mean, do you just does something funny happen, or you just get a random thought and you write it down and you try to pick it apart later, or what's that like? Do you sit down and be like, I'm going to come up with 5 minutes of material now or something?
No, I've never liked doing that for stand-up material. I think it was much more like that with the book, because with the book you've got to write 70,000 words, so it's just a different thing. Even though that said, I didn't like sitting down at the computer. I kind of wrote the opening chapters actually on a longhand on a pad out in the park, and the fresh air and kind of being outside and people and some kind of ambience and atmosphere, I think was helpful. But yeah, I think comedy initially, when I just used to do 5 minutes, 10 minutes, it would be chatting to a friend and saying a funny thing happened and trying to get a response from one of my friends who's a very funny person who's done a little bit of stand-up herself, and trying to just gauge what could work on stage. And then just sort of going through it in my head. I used to kind of go through little kind of pilot routines when I, just silently in my head when I was out for a run, or if I was going swimming or doing some kind of exercise and movement. I think movement makes the brain work as well. So I think I would think of little kind of responses to a situation that I would be talking about. Then I would think of a punchline or a ridiculous response or reaction. So yeah, although I think I think writing now is a bit different, because my shows have evolved into slightly more storytelling-y kind of shows, and obviously writing articles and writing the books. So that is more a kind of sitting down and being very disciplined.
Mm. So why don't you tell me a little bit about the book? Why did you write Is Monogamy Dead? Why subject yourself to the torture of writing a book? Yeah, I mean, it's a long slog for sure. Where did that come from?
Well, the Is Monogamy Dead was the middle part of my trilogy about love and relationships. I've mentioned the other two, the two bookends of that trilogy. And it was my Edinburgh show in 2013. And at that stage, I was in a relationship with someone that I am still very good friends with. But we had what was to me quite a confusing relationship, because to me it seemed more like a really, really awesome friendship. I mean, of course, we had a sexual and romantic element, but that didn't kind of burn us as brightly or as strongly as it maybe had done in some other previous relationships. I mean, perhaps with hindsight, that maybe was a good thing, because, of course, sometimes if you have really, really intense passion, you also have intense drama and conflict. And that can often go hand in hand with tons of arguments. So it's finding that right balance. But for me, the balance was slightly off, and it was more like a really deep friendship. So I wanted to question what really counts as a relationship. And if you're primarily in a sort of deep platonic relationship, could you maybe have sexual or romantic connections outside of that? What does that look like? And I started reading interesting books about non-monogamy, about different types of relationships, about thinking about relationships differently, in alternative ways, and going on a quest to find answers for myself. I think my shows are often a personal quest that then becomes broader. So I interviewed tons of my friends who it turned out were maybe having open relationships or different types of relationships, and finding out how that could work.
The main knock against open relationships is everyone says, well, it's a hell of a lot of work. I mean, is that kind of did you encounter that a lot when you talk to these people?
Yes, sometimes, for sure. There's a lot of time management. I mean, what I love about the poly community is there's there's tons of language to kind of deal with the complexities of that life. They've invented their own new language. Like you can say, if you've reached your threshold of partners, you can say you're polysaturated.
That's great. I haven't heard that before.
It's good, isn't it?
That's really nice.
So it's true, it is a lot of work, but I think all relationships are work. And I think that's the problem with where I was at with monogamy. I think many of me and my peers who were kind of serial monogamists who were breaking up and then getting together, breaking up and getting together, and were going through this quite tiresome pattern. I think we were trying to kind of slack off doing the work that I think is really the same whether you're in an open relationship or in an exclusive monogamous relationship. I think the work is still critical, and I don't think there's any shirking around that. I think
this is a really important point. Why don't you tell me a little bit about what you mean by the work?
Well, I just mean, probably primarily the work on yourself and working out who you are in a relationship, what you need, what you want, how to communicate that, what you have to offer and bring to another human being. I think sometimes we just launch into relationships thinking, well, we have such an amazing connection that all my problems will be solved, all their problems will be solved, everything will be brilliant and amazing. And it is for a few weeks, but then you realise that actually they've got a ton of hang-ups, or you've still got a ton of hang-ups about your childhood, or, well, that's cliche, but sometimes it's the case, or about previous relationships, or about your career frustrations. There might be a ton of things that are unresolved that comes in as baggage and that starts to wear away at this bond that you've created with a partner. So I think
Sorry, go on.
No, I just think it's about dealing with your own stuff, and then dealing with stuff together as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So where are you in monogamy these days, just personally?
Yeah, personally, I mean, I'm in a monogamous relationship now, but I think monogamy for me is quite redefined. No, I don't think, no, it's a really healthy, alive, lovely, happy relationship. But I think I had to go through this journey of sort of looking at some of the polyamorous values, if you like, of compassion and communication, to look at how I could actually communicate to that level in a monogamous relationship. And I think the level of communication about who you are, about what you're looking for, about the things that you might find challenging in your partner, that you love them anyway, but it's like, actually, you're being quite difficult today, or, what's up? You're being, I think we need to be able to communicate freely. And for me, I hadn't been very good at that before. So I think I think talking to people who are non-monogamous gave me the keys to be monogamous, which is interesting.
That's very interesting. And when you talk about improving your communication, do you just mean being more honest about your needs, about what you don't want, about, what do you mean by that?
Being more present somehow. It's hard to explain it, but yeah, being more present, being more aware of some of the things I kind of haven't liked before, but just had tolerated and kept quiet about,
So honesty, really.
Yeah.
Tell me about the Breakup Monologues.
So yes, after the solo show that I did about love and relationships, and after so many people coming to speak to me or emailing me and saying they'd enjoyed that, it seemed to make sense to open up to my other performer friends, bringing me their stories and talking to me in a kind of, a mixture of therapy session, comedy gig. It's now a podcast. It started off as a little live event, but now it's a regular monthly podcast, the Breakup Monologues, where I have 2 or 3 guests. We sort of evolved from people coming with their specific breakup stories, like, oh my God, this crazy thing happened, I did this crazy thing when my relationship ended, to more general themes, like thinking about our language around breakups and relationships, things like ghosting and all these different behaviors, conscious uncoupling, what we think of that, divorce parties, are they a good idea or is it just insane? So yeah, it's become a really fun podcast to do. And I actually recorded 2 live episodes in front of an audience just a week or so ago, so they will be released soon.
What have you learned about breakups since you began this project?
Well, I think that there are always 2 sides to the story. Obviously, in my book, I present my own version of events, but I've made a huge effort to be responsible to, and in the way that I represent other people involved in previous relationships that I'm talking about. We actually had a really interesting case here in London just recently where a female comedian was being sued by her ex-husband for talking about him on stage.
Whoa.
So, yeah, I know. So I think we have to have a kind of consciousness about how we talk about other people. But I think comedy has been a forum where we can talk very honestly about past relationships, about relationships gone wrong, about, sometimes our own bad behaviors or other people's. But I think what's been universal is that particularly I've had mostly female guests, although we've had some wonderful men on as well. I think what's been universal is actually we've tended to be able to kind of hold our hands up to our own behaviors rather than pointing the finger and going, oh, my ex was terrible, and kind of saying, God, I was a complete lunatic. I can't believe I behaved like that. So I think actually a kind of self-awareness has been a universal element.
Yeah, we are the common denominator in all of our relationships, for sure. Sometimes it takes a while for us to learn that. So what are the main... you're again, your website's a little overwhelming. Like, you do a lot of stuff, and you've done a lot of stuff. As you speak to me today, at this period in your life, what are the main sort of questions that are driving you? Like, what are you trying to figure out right now? Like, what's the most inspiring, exciting issues, questions that you're working around right now, would you say?
I do a talk about the book that I sort of tour around venues and festivals and stuff. And people always ask really fascinating questions, but I think a lot of it often comes back to this key idea about what is a relationship, what is love, and the fact that our language around love is so limiting. We say I love you, and it could mean so many different things. I kind of, I joke in one of my shows, I love chocolate and I love my girlfriend. One of those is an insatiable craving that never goes away. One of those is how I feel about my girlfriend. But, it's just this really ambiguous kind of word. So I think I have a bit of I kind of push the idea of people maybe inventing their own new language, just as the polyamory community have done. If there's not a word for something, we can't talk about it. So let's make more words. And we've now got social media, with the power of hashtags, you can make something a new buzz phrase really easily.
Well, as long as we're talking about language, before I let you go, you talk about, you mentioned conscious uncoupling.
Yeah.
And I think about a very pretentious Gwyneth Paltrow. But,
of course you do.
But yeah, like most people, I haven't looked into this phrase enough, and I'm still a little bit unclear about how that's different from a breakup. Can you give me any insight into that?
Well, much as I, like many people, don't do everything that Gwyneth Paltrow says, she's right when she says that actually it's a very, very kind of ethical and compassionate way of breaking up and retaining and celebrating some of the good things about what you had with that person, the sense of family and togetherness and friendship that you shared. And I suppose I've had, to some extent, a conscious uncoupling with the partner that I was with for the majority of the narrative in the book. We are still friends, very much so. So I think it's a great idea. And of course, it wasn't even Gwyneth who invented it. There's an author and therapist, Catherine, who I've been in touch with, who actually sort of first first coined the phrase. But yeah, I think the idea behind this sort of slightly pretentious phrase that sounds a little bit woo-woo, a friend of mine would say, there's this great idea of actually still wanting to know that person and have them in your life and have them as part of your family.
Yeah, I mean, when you put it like that, I can get behind that 100%, because I think it's very odd that we call relationships that didn't work out failed relationships or a failed marriage, when it can be, 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 of the most important years of your life in which you learned innumerable lessons and became, you both helped each other become way better versions of yourself. I mean, calling it a failed project seems insane. So I should do more research about that, because I think, yeah, you're right. I think I was a bit snotty about it. I didn't mean to be, but yeah, when you put it like that, I can get behind it 100%. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Rosie, this was a real pleasure talking to you today, and thank you for tolerating my innumerable questions about comedy and being a comedian, but this stuff is very interesting to me. If people want to connect with you, what's the best way they can do that?
Well, I really love Twitter, especially. My Twitter handle is @Rosie Wilby, which is ROSIEWILBY. I'm also on Facebook, and I have a website. rosiewilby.com is not completely current, but there's a lot of my old work on there, and there's also rosiewilbynews.blogspot.co.uk that has the latest kind of updates about all the things that are going on and gig lists and so on. But yeah, I'd love to hear from people if they're on Twitter. That's one of the main ones that I use. But obviously you can buy the book on Amazon. You can download the podcast.
The book is called?
The book is called Is Monogamy Dead? And that is available. It's paperback, Kindle and audiobook, which I narrated. And also the podcast is available free on iTunes.
The podcast is called The Breakup Monologues.
The Breakup Monologues, yes.
Brilliant. Well, Rosie, thank you so much for your time today. This was great.
Thank you.
There you have it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I hope it wasn't too scattered for you. I know we kind of bounced around a lot, and needless to say, I am still learning how to interview. I'm always trying to get better. But one thing I've been experimenting with in particularly in podcast interviews lately is following my gut a little more. I mean, when I interview someone, I'll have a list of questions, and I will try, there will be certain questions that I really, really need to get to, that I feel are really important and that are just kind of essential for me to get to. But often it's a lot more fun for me when I kind of just listen to my intuition and be okay with the conversation veering in directions that I didn't anticipate. I find that often makes for a better interview. I've been inspired, I guess, by one of the masters at this, Mr. Joe Rogan, who hosts one of the best podcasts in the world, The Joe Rogan Experience, and they're often 3 hours long. If you're not familiar with the show, they're often 3 or 4 hours long, and they veer in all kinds of really interesting directions. And he's a master at bringing things out of people that perhaps they're not often open to talking about, or they're not often used to talking about it. So I've been trying to get out of my own way a little bit and listen to my gut a little more, and I hope you're okay with that. A note before I let you go that if you want to learn more about Rosie and her work, or you want links to anything we discussed in today's episode, please go to zfstockill.com/Rosie. Or if you can't remember that, just go to humansinlove.com, and that'll take you to the podcast website where you can find show notes and my email list and everything we talked about in today's episode. Again, before I let you go, if you haven't done so already, please take 21.3 seconds out of your day. Be sure you subscribe to the show on iTunes or your podcast app of choice, and leave a rating and a review. Thank you for listening, my friends. And before I let you go, remember that life is short. So be sure to get outside at some point this week, take in the beautiful sun, take in the beautiful nature, take in the beautiful world around you. I will talk to you next Tuesday.